again to discuss things.
Let's go ahead and get into it. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of Geeky Gentleman History Month, the month in which we discuss the contributions that have been made to history by geeky gentlemen that have been ignored by biased educational system, except not at all. That joke gets funnier every time I say it, every single year. I am, of course, Sid Part 2, and I am joined today by our good friend, Mr. Red Leader Antilles, who instead of leaving paragraphs of comments on an episode of Geeky Gentleman, I just decided, hey, come on, talk. So, Red's here.
Hey, everybody.
Hey. Red reached out, said he wanted to join for an episode, and I was like, oh yeah, we could probably do something. I needed a character discussion to get recorded, so I asked Red what character with a historical background he wanted to talk about, keeping in mind that the rules are the character has to be either created over 100 years ago, or they have to be consistently set within a historical era. So Jack Sparrow counts, Zeus counts, pre-crisis Jason Todd, not so much. What you got for us, Red?
So I picked the original Sandman of the 50 comic book characters with that name at this point, Wesley Dodds.
Indeed. Now this is a character you have a lot of admiration for, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
Okay. This is one of those character discussions where I know of the character very loosely, but I really don't know anything about him because I've never read the character properly. He's like shown up in a couple different things that I've read, but just in the background, maybe gets one or two lines kind of situation.
Mm-hmm.
So what made you want to discuss Sandman?
Well, the thing with Sandman that just really compels me, especially Matt Wagner's Sandman Mystery Theater, is so often when we try and reinvent Golden Age characters, we either move them forward a bit or spruce them up to an extent, like make them a little bit more timeless. But Sandman was created in, I think, like late 1939 for World's Fair Comics #1, which became World's Finest. But they moved him back to 1938, and on top of that, made him so rooted in, post-Great Depression politics. Like, the entire first arc, the Tarantula, is actually more or less about kind of the aftermath of Prohibition and, former criminals trying to clean up their books, essentially, for all those profits they made, and how does the legal system deal with criminals who, did something that was illegal just a few years prior? How exactly does that affect, like, the DA, who's heavily connected to this stuff? And just that is the thing that Wagner consistently does with Wesley that's so compelling. He always puts him into that context, and sometimes in ways that are quite uncomfortable. Like, The Face is all about racism and police corruption and stuff like that in Chinatown, and it kind of just ends with, hell if we know how to fix this, because Wes has some bigotry to. He grew up in, like, he was in Asia at points. He keeps calling it the Orient, which kind of shows the more old worldy, less than perfect, attitude he has. And so you get someone who is virtuous, is a good man, and is progressive, but
is still from his time.
Exactly. And he carries all of that baggage, warts and all. Like, there's a detective character, Detective Burke, who's like sort of his Jim Gordon, like, first arc in, he's just a drunk and he's an asshole. And they have a point where someone's asking me as a family, and he's like, "Oh, I had a sister, but she married an N-word, so I don't talk to her anymore." And it's like, that so on point for the kind of people where it's like, he is a good detective, and for the perspective of Sandman Mystery Theater, he's a good man. He's also a racist piece of shit.
Yeah, which is just, it makes sense because while there certainly have always been people who are ahead of their time, you can't expect people to be ahead of their time. You know, when we talk about how a society forms a personality, there are things where you wouldn't even know that what you're thinking, that the thoughts you have are wrong, because you have very little context to see that they're wrong. There's very little incentive to see something that is wrong in and of itself. And that doesn't make it excusable. That doesn't make it okay. But it just makes it what it is. It's just something that you like have to kind of accept and move on from when you're talking about things historically and talking about characters and people historically. And I really appreciate that as part of the fiction, because it just makes it feel more genuine. It makes it feel like it's more properly rooted in the time. Whereas you can watch a lot of things that take place in a historical era, but like everybody's so modern except for the villains that it just seems kind of silly.
Yeah,
you know?
Doctor Who has that habit sometimes of, if we're gonna have a, like, ally of the Doctor for the week set in Victorian London, of course they're gonna be progressive. And it's just like...
And not just progressive for the time, progressive for now.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's the extra part. It's not even like, oh, children shouldn't work. It's like, oh, gay rights should be a thing. And it's like, no, you don't even have the context to be able to think of that.
Yeah, it almost comes off as more disingenuous by not acknowledging the fact that, no, even decent people in the past were kind of dicks in some ways. And that puts it in a better context, and also can be used to highlight certain ways that people were progressing at that time. Like, one of the great things with Wesley Dodds is, like, Sandman Mystery Theater has a lot of interesting stuff with second wave feminism, and Diane, Wesley's sort of love interest, but more than that, like, crime fighting partner, not even sidekick. And what's great about that is that isn't a case of Wagner adding a progressive thing to the character. If you go back and read that early stuff, she is absolutely treated in 1940 as his complete equal.
Interesting.
And it's fantastic. Like, you go back to some of those early Sandman stories, or his appearances in, like, I have an oversized copy of All-Star Comics #3, the first appearance of the JSA as a team, because of course I do. And in there, it's so strange seeing, like, you'll have Joan, or Joanne, Jay Garrick's love interest, be the more stereotypical love interest. And then in the Sandman story, Diane's just completely progressive. He's able to get herself out of situations. He's like everything that is great about Lois Lane without falling into all of those traps that we often do. And so by highlighting, the fact that these characters do have a lot of, bigotry within them, or bias, and even when they are quite progressive, the stuff that they are progressive with was actually things that, Gardner Fox and Bert Christman were progressive in.
Yeah, that's the thing that's really interesting to look at. And I didn't know that about Sandman. I had a very limited knowledge on the Wesley Dodds Sandman. My Sandman will always, of course, be Neil Gaiman's. But just the connections to the historical era in which he's set is really, really fascinating. And Wagner does seem like the type of writer to actually take those ideas somewhere and go with them and really explore them and deal with it, because that's just the type of writer he is. He's a smarter writer than a lot of people give him credit for. Mm-hmm. So that's really cool. To kind of transition away from Matt Wagner, though, do you think that Sandman has been written with a consistent lead to the past across the board, or do you think it's really only Wagner that captured the right voice for the character?
What's interesting with Wesley is he kind of disappears to an extent. Like, Bert Kreisman, who was the artist and co-creator of the character, actually left pretty early on. In fact, like, Wagner actually plays with, like, leading into World War II and Americans trying to fight fascism when the government doesn't want to. And lo and behold, Bert Kreisman was actually a member of the Flying Tigers, but sadly died in he was shot down and died while parachuting. But, like, he is a fantastic example of, real-world historical heroes. And so, sadly, after he died, the character got passed along repeatedly to, or I guess the title, not necessarily the character, importantly, got passed along, and Diane disappears, and he gets a sidekick called Sandy the Golden Boy, who's just him in a smaller costume. And now Jeff Johns makes Sandy fantastic, and he's amazing in Justice Society. And they play with him a bit in All-Star Squadron. But Wesley didn't really show up much in that stuff. Like, he got redesigned by Weisner and Norris, and then Simon and Kirby actually took over the character and
created a whole new thing.
Well, no, they took over Wesley and then had him join the army, actually.
Okay.
And then in the Silver Age, we got the... Like, he occasionally would show up in, Crisis on Two Earth kind of crossovers that we would get. And they would play with that to an extent. But, yeah, more or less he was gone. And they had transitioned over to... God, I forget his name. But the... Stanford, who's the Kirby one. And then there was... so the more colorful one by Jack Kirby. That lasted for a while. And, of course, Gaiman kind of resurrected that idea, which I haven't actually read Gaiman's Sandman, but I'm wondering, so how much does Wesley get hinted at in that?
It's funny, we just did Comic Book Club on Volume 1 of Sandman. He's in the first issue. In the first issue of Gaiman's Sandman, Morpheus is captured, and there are all these profiles of different characters right before he's captured, and then they keep appearing throughout the issue, so you see, like, what the God of Dreams capturing had an effect on the world. And so there's, like, a girl who goes to sleep and never really wakes up, or only wakes up, like, 2-3 times a year, and just there's this guy who, like, is technically awake but just wanders around like a zombie, can't talk, can't anything. And Wesley Dodds is there, and he has dreams of people doing bad things, and the only way he can stop those dreams is to go out in the night as the Sandman, and that makes him sleep well, is the only thing Gaiman really hints at toward him.
Yeah, and what's neat is the prophetic dreams is a thing from the Golden Age, but it had just never been explained. And so Gaiman plays with that, and obviously Wagner bounces off that, and they have a crossover, Sandman Midnight Theater, I believe it was a one-shot where they crossed over those two books and co-wrote that. But yeah, it was really neat that Gaiman, wanted to use the Kirby Sandman, totally wasn't allowed, so he creates his own one, and uses that as a way to allow someone else to create a jumping off point for the other Sandman.
Yep. And just isn't allowed to do it, so he has to come up with a new pitch. It pitches the greatest story ever told. But that's neither here nor there. Yeah, so the title of Sandman getting passed around, I didn't realize that Wesley Dodds had been so kind of abandoned and forgotten about. I knew they tried to reboot the character, but that's more just like Jack Kirby having an idea for like a different thing that uses the same name. I always understood it as. So it's just, I don't know, I guess I expected Sandman to kind of always be in the back pocket of the DC universe and just be somewhere doing something, but never have a series, kind of like, I don't know, Zatanna. So it's interesting to hear that he was largely ignored up until Wagner came back around. In that case, then, do you think that Sandman is an example of like one of those Golden Age heroes that there is legitimately interesting stuff to do with, but no one seems to pick up on it until just the right time? Or do you think that Wagner just kind of lucked in, or Wagner just had a really good story and he was able to mold it around Sandman?
Sandman's interesting. I mean, I was just reading the foreword by Dave Marsh on the first volume of Mystery Theater, and he kind of talks about Dodds being a weird mix of the Mystery Men idea from the Golden Age and pulp heroes. And even though he had cookie cutter stories, you had the prophetic dreams, and you had, the gas gun and the fedora and the gas mask, and that kind of gave him at least something. So it's an interesting case where I don't think there was necessarily a lot to work with there in the first place, but Wagner kind of, took... Or I guess there was a lot to work with, but he was a very cookie-cutter character, and so Wagner just said, well then let's explore 1930s politics with that. You have someone with a cool aesthetic and a lot of weird but amazing potential. Why not go ahead and use that as your jumping off point?
Okay. All right, so let's move on to something that you just mentioned then, the design for the Sandman, the gas mask and the gas gun and all that stuff. So you mentioned like Wagner wanted to play around with the 1930s politics. The gas mask seems to be an image kind of tied to the kind of the World War I, World War II in between era, because they're still used till this day, but it's something that seems so iconically out of the First World War and beyond, and kind of lays around in that middle ground. And it's just, I don't know if anyone's interested, the development of the gas mask as a tool on the battlefield is really interesting, because of course the biological weapons or chemical weapons, that's what I want. The chemical weapons were developed before anyone had an idea of how to defend against them. There was no real sense of what to do about them if you're going to be attacked by them. And of course, the people developing them had very little interest in protecting the soldiers deploying them. So the gas mask had to kind of be invented on the battlefield, World War I, and it started with just people tying bandanas around their faces and wearing goggles, and it just kind of developed naturally from there, out of necessity, of course. So it's interesting to tie that all together. Do you think it's a bit of a kooky ass premise though?
Guy somehow has prophetic dreams and also creates a special gas gun that has knockout gas?
Well, I mean, just the running around in a gas mask with the knockout gas and all that stuff. Is it just a little too kooky to work anywhere outside of the Golden Age? Like, it would have been created today, everyone would just laugh it off?
To an extent, but there's also Wagner doesn't have to do much with the or I guess that's more so on Guy Davis. Doesn't have to do much. He kind of just has to mute the colors And right off the bat, you have like a very striking pulp hero out of that. So I think there is kind of the potential, as long as, like, I think Dynamite would publish him. DC and Marvel, if he was created today, wouldn't. Dynamite would.
Okay. All right, I think that's fair. I don't know, the design of the character is something that's always stuck out to me. I think that might be one reason that he stuck around in like the consciousness as much as he did, because there's about 1 million failed Golden Age heroes that just quit being published, and it's because their designs are, you know, you can only do so much with the circus strongman underpants and stuff like that, and the capes and everything. Whereas Sandman seems to just, like, it is very unique. Yeah. I can't think of anyone else that has that kind of look to him. The gas mask does add quite a bit.
Yeah, and it helps being on the cover of the JSA stuff.
How does the gas gun work? Because I don't think I have much of an understanding of that.
So, let me see. Yeah, so his gas gun, I think, is just like a normal pistol, or maybe it's something used from World War I. I would need to check on that, but essentially he makes his chemical, puts it into a canister, and then always has that snapped in. And he has usually one extra canister, and that depends on how much he uses. And I think there are times when it has like a, like a barbed wire harpoon in it, if he needs to catch someone. Because Wes, especially later, is more violent. And I mean, especially because Wagner can either be very wholesome, or, oh dear God in heaven, Sandman Mystery Theater is dark. Like, we're talking first arc has women getting mutilated, deals with, like, a whole child abuse, incest plot. And he keeps going back to that, and it gets to a point where it's like, can you just let us be happy for 5 minutes without showing prostitutes get beheaded? Like, I get you're trying to be visceral and really drive home a point, but, like, Wagner knows how to make you feel. He's a lot like Tom King in that way.
That's, I don't know, I certainly felt that a bit with the Wagner stuff. Like, I can't remember the character's name in Zorro, but there's this captain that Zorro kept just making a buffoon of, and he'd like leave the Z mark, and he'd actually cut it into him because it was a more intense Zorro like that. And eventually it just happened enough that like the guy got discharged from the army and started going on a vendetta against Zorro. And it got to the point where like Zorro left without cutting him, and the dude's like, "You forgot to leave your mark this time," and like pulled out a knife and did it himself. And it's like, shit, that's so no, I know exactly what you're talking about. Wagner's ability to get like just a little too tortured with it, and you're like, oh god, this is creepy. So is the violence thing in Wagner's Sandman stuff, is that like trying to say something about the development of the politics? Because you're saying 1930s politics, we talking late 30s? Is this
1938?
Okay, so is this do you think it's commenting on the rise of fascism and hate crimes and stuff like that?
Oh yeah, I mean, the villain in the first arc doesn't actually have anything to do with hate crimes. They're killing women in order to scare the sister who's blackmailing the father and all kinds of things. But essentially he's wearing a black KKK uniform. And so there's definitely a visceral thing going on there. And you start to play with, again, you're dealing with, I mean, it's Chinatown, but still kind of setting up the derogatory attitude towards Asian Americans at that time, and Wagner definitely plays with fascism, and of course that goes back to the original character. I mean, he came out, I think, like a month before the U.S. entered the war.
Oh, wow.
And so, of course, you have a guy who would join the Flying Tigers. And so, yeah, like, I think Wagner definitely wanted to go for that and kind of amp up the violence from what you'd usually get with mob stuff, and kind of, you have the mob present, but it's more about the societal ramifications of that. So you get what the mob's doing in the face has less to do with what the mob's doing and more with them, murdering prostitutes in order to scare people and corrupt cops operating and stuff like that. So it's more focused on, those broader strokes of fascism, specifically within the U.S.
Okay. Trying to think what else we can talk about. You want to take us somewhere on this? Because we need to fill a few more minutes.
I think what's really cool is after Sandman Mystery Theater, because to the fantasticness that is Wesley and Diane's relationship, like, they never get married, but they're life partners for decades, and they're actually in a secure relationship. And in Starman, Jack Knight, who's the current Starman at the time, his dad's a superhero, his brother's a superhero, and yet he admires Diane, not Wesley, because he's all obsessed with the past. He runs an antique store, or not an antique store, he runs like a pawn shop sort of thing, and he's obsessed with her mystery novels, because that's a thing that Wagner was dealing with, and then James Robinson picked up on with Diane being a novelist and basing her stories on their adventures. And so you get a really neat kind of thing with a superhero who's inspired by the writing of a hero's love interest instead of the hero himself. And Robinson does great stuff when he occasionally touches upon them. And I think Wesley is in the flashback issue where they talk about, I'm forgetting his name, the guy who has like a pumpkin head mask who the JSA accidentally murders.
I have no idea.
He like threatens to kill all their families and then tries to escape, and they all make blasts, and I think it's Ragdoll or something, or one of the original Ragman men, and like they feel guilty because they kind of accidentally killed a guy. But
like you do.
Yeah. And of course Wesley's involved in that, if I'm not mistaken. But in JSA, he's actually introduced at the beginning, and Dream shows up, if I'm not mistaken, where Wes is like 99, and he's just like hiking up Mount Everest or something, or some mountain, and I forget, because it's been a while since I read Justice Be Done, which is the first arc, but he dies there, and it's epic. He's just having a conversation with... Diane's already died by this point, but he's having a conversation with her in his head, and talking about how proud he is of Sandy the Golden Boy, but grown up, and because he became a sand creature, you see, in the 70s. He got turned into a giant sand monster, and so...
Yeah, that makes sense.
So then when he reconstitutes, he's still young. But he can now, like, turn into sand. Yeah, it happens. It happens to everyone sooner or later. But yeah, so he has this just epic last stand with the villain where he uses the gas gun one last time, knowing that so the guy and him both fall off of, like, Mount Everest and die. And then he, like, passes the Dream, he passes his connection onto Sand. And so, like, we never really try to bring him back in a modern context. Like, we have Jay Garrick be active years later. We have Alan Scott attached to the star thingy, because he gets that asteroid with the lantern. I never understood that, but he becomes Sentinel, and Wildcat still kicking. But Sandman is so rooted in being, a post-World War II or post-World War I lead up into America joining the war character. That is his existence. So when the rest of the JSA is continuing on, he's kind of just there as a reminder of the pulp aspects, and he never needs to come back. He doesn't need to be someone who's currently active or sometimes getting involved. He lived his life. He was able to settle down. He was content, and that's something you don't usually get.
Yeah, with superheroes, you don't get an ending.
Well, especially with Golden Age heroes, because DC has a weird tendency to bring back obscure ones and then kill them or make them into villains, which is really annoying. And so, I guess by dying, he was able to avoid
circumvent that.
Yeah.
Until next week. Oh. No, I get you. It is cool it's rare to get a character's end and have it feel good. So with that in mind, do you want anything to pick up with Wesley Dodds again, or has he kind of had the perfect ending?
I mean, Mystery Theater got 70 issues, and that very much was Wagner's baby, but I do feel like with DC always kind of trying to do some mystery-themed book, like, what was it, Gotham After Midnight and stuff like that. I think that if someone had a legitimately good idea for an anthology, or maybe something akin to All-Star Western, but set in the 30s, or, if they reinvented weird war tales with Wes in the Army, I think there is a potential for that if they ever want to go back, because you have the other members of the JSA who were apparently are bringing back sooner or later, what with all the hinting. But I do think Wesley does have a place for stories set specifically in that time period, and if they really, whenever they want to link back, I think there would be a good chance. I wouldn't be against John's using him here and there, or, I mean, honestly, we always go for it, but Tom King depress all of us.
The next Tom King, Mitch Gerard series, Sandman, the Depressing.
That actually would be a good pick for, his next miniseries.
Maxi-series or something? I don't know. No, I can see it. Well, we're close enough. We can wrap up now. I think we're good. So thanks for doing this again, Red.
No problem.
All right, it was fun. Until next time, everyone, I'm the Philosopher.
And I'm the Rogue One.
And we are your Geeky Gentlemen. And we will be discussing things.